and I gave her my story. I'm looking for books on the intelligence in the ancient world. And she said, well, I've got some of those, but why don't you call and speak with the world's recognized expert in the subject, a friend of mine named Rose Mary Sheldon at VMI. Well, I made the call to Rose Mary Sheldon, and not only did she give me the list of the books that she had written on the subject based on her expertise in the ancient world, including the ability to read all of those ancient languages as well. Not only did she give me the list of books, she sent me the exact material that she had, and so she's very generous, and I've appreciated knowing her ever since. But since those days, which could have been perhaps even 30 years ago, Rose Mary has continued to produce the most unique books in the field of espionage ever printed. She's been the author of at least a dozen books on different subjects from the ancient world. Her latest book is unique. It's called Ambush, and it's about a covert operation you can see on the screen here. Well, I'm wasting her time, but I'd like to introduce Colonel Rose Mary Sheldon.
I was 12 when I got that first phone call. It's been many years since I've given my first talk to AFIO, and you still remain my favorite audience because I never have to explain to you the importance of intelligence, which you do to almost every other group you speak to. The difficulty for me is in explaining why something that happened 2,000 years ago would be relevant to people who work on the front lines of modern intelligence. But I'm a professional historian, that's my job, and that's why they pay me the medium bucks. The subject of my book is ambush. We've recently been involved in a war in Iraq. We're still in a war in Afghanistan, and the headlines are filled with stories of Americans being ambushed, and we hate it. We don't like this sort of thing. It makes us angry. We think it's unfair. Why don't they come out and fight like men so we can kill them fairly? And historians would have you think that Americans have their hands tied behind their back because of our culture, that Westerners don't do this, that Easterners do, that they're sneaky and we're not. And I want to kind of show you that there's a long history for ambush on both sides. They always want to blame everything on the Greeks, and in a sense I'm doing that too, because it's Herodotus who, in writing about the Persian Wars, says those sneaky Persians and we hoplites that fight face-to-face, mano-a-mano. This is the standard picture of the hoplite phalanx, heavily armed, fighting in the front lines, don't sneak up on anybody. Two groups of gentlemen meet on the field and decide fairly who would win, because the first formation to break loses, and whoever wins gets the agricultural land they've been fighting over. Just to give you a brief view of some of the historians that have talked about this, M.R. Davey, in talking about the evolution of war, says the essence of savage warfare is treachery and ambush. Primitive military tactics consist of stratagem and surprise and attack. The classic by Ardon de Pique, war between savage tribes between Arabs. Even today is a war of ambush by small groups of men, of which each one at the moment of surprise chooses not his adversary, but his victim, and is an assassin. James Fenimore Cooper talked about the Indians and said that while white men could not ambush women and children in war, it was a signal virtue in Indian. He just somehow forgets that just a few decades before, it was the Americans hiding behind the trees ambushing the British. Charles Oman's History of the Art of War in the Middle Ages. At least once the spirit of the Greek hoplite compared close to that of the Franks, of whom he says to win by ambushes, night attacks and surprises, seems despicable to the Frankish mind. So right into the Middle Ages, we don't do that. Now, lest you think this is the product of 19th century historiography, here we have 2004, H. John Poole saying, since the Crusades, Westerners have noticed how differently those who live east of Constantinople fight. Eastern adversaries routinely avoid set-piece battles. Obviously, he's never heard of the Battle of Calderon, but we'll get to that in a moment. And then John Keegan, the late great, who just recently passed away, says, Oriental warfare is different and apart from European warfare, relying on evasion, delay, and indirectness. H. Kendrick Pritchard, who was one of the great experts on Greek warfare, says the same thing. The Greeks do not ambush. And he had 5 volumes of Greek war stories to tell in which he could not find any ambushes at all. And he says that the Greeks and the Romans were far removed from such malpractices as plotting mischief against their friends with the purpose of aggrandizing their own power, that they would not even consent to get the better of their enemies by fraud. And then we have the ever-popular Victor Davis Hanson, who says, guerrilla and loosely organized irregular forces, the neo-terrorists, who for centuries have been despised by Western governments and identified with the ill-equipped, landless, poor. He says there's a repugnance, is there not, for hit-and-run tactics, for skirmishing and ambush. It is a burdensome legacy of the West that battle under any other disguise except head-to-head confrontation is unpalatable. So let's start from the beginning. The earliest document we have in Greek, of course, is the Iliad. And everybody remembers Achilles, or Brad Pitt, whichever your happens to be. But if you read the Iliad, look at what they're talking about. Achilles accuses Agamemnon of having the heart of a deer. He says, you're a coward. Why? Because you never dared to go into an ambush with the chief men of the Achaeans, because that way lies death. In other words, you have to be brave to go into an ambush with the best men of the Greeks. This is a rather long speech of the leader of the Cretans, but he says, for now, all of the best of us were being chosen beside the ship for an ambush in which the valor of men is best discerned. In other words, we take the best men to do this, and they have to be brave. People who want to say that the Iliad does not support ambush will take a passage about Paris, concealed behind a gravestone, wounding Diomedes with an arrow. And he wounds him, and then Paris is accused of being a coward. Of course, he's not fighting hand-to-hand. He's an archer. We all know also Paris is a lover, not a fighter. But it's not really an ambush, because that's what archers do. They hide behind cover, and they shoot at you. There's Paris. I am amazed that people think there are no ambushes in the Iliad, because the entire 10th book of the Iliad is a story of an ambush. We have Dolon, who is a Trojan spy. Both generals on each side in the middle of the night are worrying, what is the other side doing? And there's only one thing you do in that situation: you send out spies to find out. And so 2 groups come from either side. On one side, you have Odysseus and Diomedes, 2 of the best fighters they have. The other side of the Trojans, you have Dolon. He's described as having been raised with 5 sisters, not a good sign. He's been spoiled by his parents, and he's bragging about he's going to catch Achilles' armor, and he's going to do this and he's going to do that. Well, when it gets into the dark and he's sneaking around alone, suddenly he's scared. They ambush him. They kill him as soon as they get the information they need from him. They store his stuff on the side of the road. They sneak off because he has told them where the allies are camped. 2 Greeks show up in the camp of the allies, slit their throats at night in their sleeping bags or whatever the Greeks slept in, okay? Steal the horses, come back, pick up Dolon's stuff from the side of the road, get back to the camp, wash up like nothing's happened, had a nice big cup of wine, and did what an entire unit might not have been able to do in daytime. It's not that the story hasn't been noticed. It's that Greek scholars will actually say, well, this isn't really part of the Iliad. It was added later, because Greeks don't do this sort of thing. It's there, and it's been proven by philologists better than myself that this is indeed a part of the Iliad. The thing about the Greeks is there are 2 epics. There's the Iliad, there's the Odyssey. There is Achilles, who fights face-to-face, mano-a-mano, and is known for being brave, but there's also Odysseus, the sneaky guy, the man of many twists and turns. And both of those ethics are part of the Greek mentality, because sometimes you fight straight up and sometimes you sneak up on them. It all depends on the situation. Pick your actor, whichever Odysseus you'd like. Odysseus is famous for having snuck up on Polyphemus, the famous Cyclops, and put a burning spear in his eye while he's asleep. That's hardly what you'd call gentlemanly behavior. We know, and historians do not agree even on this point, how a hoplite phalanx fought. It all depends on how close you want to put them to the person next to them. Some people put it at 3 feet, in which case you really would be close together with your shield protecting them. Some people put it at 6 feet, in which case there's room between those soldiers to put archers between them. You can also see them squatting to protect themselves from archers on the other side. Here you have mixed hoplites and archers. Oops, sorry. Back. There you've got an archer hiding behind a hoplite, taking cover from his shield. Here you see a mixed contingent. Here you've got fallen archer down over here, obviously was in the middle of the fray when the fight started. Here you see a hoplite here, archer hiding behind them there. So the Greeks have different kinds of fighters. They have regular hoplites. They also have archers, they also have slingers, and they use light arms. Because we only look at the Athenians and the Spartans, because that's where all the information comes from. That's where we have all our information about. And we focus on that and we say, this is the way the Greeks fought. But there were poor Greeks. There were people from Acarnania, people who could get together with maybe a spear, maybe a rock, maybe a sling, whatever they could bring to the fight. They couldn't afford all of that armor. And so they would do ambushing and skirmishing. Not to mention the fact that only about 18% of the land mass in Greece isn't mountainous, which means if you're living in the mountains, you're not going to have a hoplite phalanx because you need a large, flat area to operate on. Here's another archer from the Temple of Apphia at Aegina. This would be what the 3-foot intervals look like. This would be what the 6-foot intervals look like. So there's plenty of place in between these fighters to also put other kinds of skirmishers who could just kill the people who hit the ground, if nothing else. I've managed to go through as much Greek literature as I could get my hands on, and I've come up with 77 examples of night attacks. And that can only be an ambush, because nobody fights at night unless they have to. 17 examples of dawn attacks. You attack them while they're still asleep. 52 examples of out-and-out ambushes. At sea, there are examples of an army or a fleet leaving at night to avoid a battle, and at sea, assault landings, again, that usually happen first thing in the morning. So that, so several hundred examples, all told, of things that people claim the Greeks don't do. Thucydides himself talks about night attacks. He says, something happened expinaios, meaning all of a sudden or by surprise. In the winter of 429, the Thebans had entered the city of Plataea at night, scared the living daylights out of the Plataeans. So the fright was caused by the invasion being done at night when they could not see, but also they thought a great far number had come into the city. So surprise is a force multiplier. You have fewer people than they think, but you make it look like you have more. Herodotus says the Phocians covered themselves with chalk, with gypsum, and invaded at night. That way, A, they could see each other and recognize each other, and it scared the other side because they thought they were ghosts. So they'll use disguise, they'll use deception, whatever they needed. In 425, the Athenians capture 120 Spartan hoplites alive, and this is unusual. It was never done anywhere else in the war, because Spartans would usually, fight to the death. But they got them on a cigar-shaped island, and they got him in one end and took them alive. And again, it was because of surprise landings on both sides of the island. Here you got Sphacteria, which is a long island here, and this is where they get them. These are the two landing sites on either side. And you get them, you surprise them, you corner them so fast, they don't even know what happens, and the next thing you know, they are captive, and that leads to the war being called for a truce in 421 because the Spartans just gave in to get the live guys back. The Athenians storm the Epipolae at night. If you've ever been to Syracuse in Sicily, it's one of the most heavily fortified positions, but again, if you take it at night. Problem is they weren't very good at it. They didn't do enough reconnaissance, and when they got up there, they got beaten. By the middle of the 5th century, they're using deception. We have night attacks by the famous general Demosthenes, not the same guy as the orator. He sends in Messenians first because he knows they speak a similar dialect as the Spartans and that they would be mistaken for Spartans, and so they could get through the front lines. Just before dawn, he falls on them again when they're sleeping. We find people attacked during lunch. We find people attacked during siesta. We find them at night when they're asleep or in the morning before they've awakened. By the 4th century, and the Peloponnesian War goes on for 30 years. It's an entire generation of people fighting. It's going to change the whole face of Greek warfare because hoplites are dying. They're getting poor. They're getting broke. Nobody can afford to put this kind of armor in the field anymore. And they're also noticing that when you ambush them, it works pretty well. So now both sides are learning to ambush. And they realize that you have to do this with mobile troops. And so the lighter they are, get rid of the hoplite armor, get them a wicker shield and a sharp sword, and send them out there and go chase the hoplites. And they're using mercenaries. These are peltasts, and they're called this because they have this wicker shield and a long peltast spear. So this isn't fighting necessarily up close. You can chase people and throw spears at them. You can sneak up behind them and throw spears at them. You can fall out of trees and throw spears at them. It doesn't matter. You're not in that closed formation anymore. There's another peltast. So what I did, I said, if it's not that we're Western, they're Eastern, if it's not that they're sneaky and we're honest, why do you do an ambush? What does ambush come from? Not a lack of morals, it's situational. And so I went to modern handbooks, Ranger Handbook, Light Infantry, Platoon Squad, I got Russian translations, I got British handbooks, and I went through them and I said, okay, let's find the 10 reasons why people ambush. Because Mr. Monk and I like the number 10. It's even. Reason number 1, because it's a force multiplier when you're outnumbered. You need advanced intelligence to attack a powerful, more formidable enemy, to take advantage of them before they can attack you. And if your force is less heavily armed than the other side. Reason number 2, when it's the only mode of attack available. If you have the biggest army in town, go out and fight them. But if you've got a small bunch of people, or they're only peltasts, you're going to have to ambush the other side. It may be the only kind of forces you can put in the field because you can't afford anything else. 3, to establish the element of surprise. Armies on the march, fall out of the trees, attack them from the side. When they're marching, they're not in armor, they're carrying their armor. And so you have a good chance of being able to beat them. You strike the enemy at a time or place or in a manner for which they are unprepared. It also allows you to be on the sides of roads or in ditches or behind trees. If surprise and shock are achieved, you can beat an enemy 2 or 3 times your size. I've always heard the statistic that if you create more than 10% casualties on the other side, it kind of stops them dead in their tracks. That's enough of a shock to do it. I've never actually seen that in print. But in other words, you want to achieve a kill very fast. When the terrain dictates it. Again, if you are in rocky territory, if you're in the mountains, if you're in a place where you can get in a gully, hide behind trees, bushes, it could be weather, if there's fog. Anything that comes up at the time that's going to give you an advantage, and Greece has a lot of this kind of terrain. So it's kind of strange to think that the Greeks only had one form of fighting dictated by being in a large open plain when the vast majority of the terrain situations in Greece simply won't support that. When the opportunity presents itself, sometimes even you don't know there's going to be a surprise. Surprise. Enemies marching down, you find out about it ahead of time, and you say, okay, they're coming this way, where can we hide, and let's kill them when they come through. I always like passes, you know, with high mountains on both sides. It's always good. You just block up both ends of the pass and you're ready to roll. Speed and surprise give more security to your own unit. Night, rain, snow, smoke, dust, fog all help to mask the troops, but you have to kill them all. Because if you don't kill them all, they will turn on you or they'll call in other forces. It can be used as a diversion. While you're busy ambushing them over here, your main force can be over there, sneaking up on somebody that isn't expecting it. Ambush is used to capture intelligence assets, and there are any number of these, especially in Xenophon. You capture natives, and you use them as guides, or you ask them, is that well poisoned? Does this road lead to the capital? Have you seen the enemy? Reason 8, it's part of the deception plan. You use it to mislead the enemy, to make them think you're after something you're not, or you find out what their intelligence resources are. You probe them to find out what they know. Ambush to demoralize the enemy. Again, nobody likes being ambushed. And so if it keeps happening to them, they get annoyed and then they can get demoralized. So if you can do a big enough kill, you may get a political settlement out of it, nothing else. Because your intelligence assets are better than the enemy's. To this audience, I don't have to explain it, but you can't have an ambush without intelligence because you need to know where they are, and you have to be sure they don't know where you are. And so trapping them means having better intelligence assets than the other side, at least temporarily. If you can anticipate enemy locations and movements, you can use it to neutralize them. So the Greeks both admired and used ambushes when appropriate. Does this mean that's all they did? No. Does this mean that it's a better thing to do than have a huge battlefield success? No. It's that one is used for one thing and the other is used for something else. You use different kinds of troops at different times to achieve different ends. The victim of the ambush always calls the ambushers cowardly. When it's your side ambushing, aren't we clever?